be done putting those abominations in their place. But instead of ranting about them nonstop for like 20 minutes, I'm going to rant about them for the next 20 minutes in a slightly more structured way, a top 10 video. Yes, again, this is how I organize what I'm saying, and don't get distracted on random tangents. Get used to it. Hello, demigods, mortals, and monsters. It's your friendly neighborhood demigod lover, and today's video is the top 10 problems with the Percy Jackson movies. So as almost every Percy Jackson fan knows, 20th Century Fox tried to adapt the Percy Jackson book franchise into movies, and they only turned out 2 of the 5 books into movies. Why? Because those movies kind of sucked. What's so terrible about them is that if they were made into good movies, they could have been a huge franchise. Like, there was so much potential here. I'm talking Harry Potter level potential. So what's wrong with the movies? Well, basically everything. But obviously some things are more issues than others. So I've compiled a list of the top 10 biggest problems with the Percy Jackson movies. 10. One thing about the Percy Jackson books is that almost all the characters, even the side characters, the antagonists, or the gods, are given some depth of character. I mean, aside from the truly evil villains like Kronos, Gaia, Tartarus, etc. Because you're not supposed to feel any form of sympathy for cannibals or psychopaths. But other than that, every character has motivations behind what they do, and they're not just one thing all the time. Ethan wants the minor gods to be recognized. Hades doesn't want to fight for a family who's mistreated him for millennia. Selena doesn't want Beckendorf to get hurt. Luke doesn't want other demigods to be treated as poorly as he was. Hermes wants Luke to know that he cares deeply for him, but is not allowed to interfere with his fate. In the movie, Hermes does care for Luke, but not nearly as much. Selena has a brief cameo appearance in Sea of Monsters that depicts her as willfully betraying Camp Half-Blood. As when Luke eats the Golden Fleece, she says, "It took him long enough to find it." As I said, in the books she was a blackmailed spy who only helped Luke to keep Beckendorf from being hurt. But I guess the movies just kind of felt like throwing that out the window entirely, so. In the movies, Hades was just kind of this chaotic force who only really cared about power. Why? I genuinely don't understand why they felt the need to change this, because Hades in the Lightning Thief movie is a lot like Ares in the Lightning Thief book. So they just kind of took almost everything about Ares, made him more of a comedy relief, and turned him into Hades. Why did they feel the need to make this change? The only way they benefit from it is minor plot convenience, but they lose a lot more, as in a pretty good chunk of The Last Olympian. It kind of makes Nico's redemption a little weird. Because how are we meant to cheer for Nico as he leads an army of skeletons and 3 fully powered gods into battle if we believe that the most powerful out of those 3 gods is evil? Yes, in the first book, Hades was intimidating and scary. I mean, duh, he's the god of the underworld. But he wasn't flat out evil. Luke is also portrayed as kind of flat and boring character. He's just a kid with daddy issues, as opposed to actually being given a complex and interesting backstory. It doesn't even make sense with Luke's portrayal to make him just a kid with daddy issues. Most of the Half-Bloods to portray the gods in the war were unclaimed. Everyone at Camp Half-Blood has mommy and daddy issues. But still, most demigods have some sort of consolation that they shouldn't flat out hate their parents. Sure, they may have awkward relationships with their godly parents, but they still think they're cool. I know Luke's backstory isn't really addressed much until the later books, but I just don't like that they made him seem like just a kid with daddy issues. Also, he seems motivated by revenge in the movies, which again is kind of flat and boring compared to the books, where he was misguided into thinking that if he succeeded in rising Kronos, the lives of demigods would be easier and less unfair. 9. The humor. Riordan knows how to balance great humor with a heartfelt and emotional journey. The movies failed at telling an emotionally compelling story. I mean, they didn't even try with that one. They tried to add in some humor, and it didn't work. It really didn't. One thing with humor is that you have to know when it should and shouldn't be added. You have to be aware of when it enhances the story as opposed to when it makes the stakes anticlimactic. The humor of the books is in the funny chapter titles, moments like the pink poodle, the thrill ride of love, other goofy moments, mostly in more lighthearted scenes, but there's humor in some darker moments too. The movies didn't include quite as much humor, and when they tried, they failed miserably. The main humor of the movies is in the scene in the underworld. Hades was made a total comedy character, which is not good. There was some humor in the underworld scene in the books too, like how Charon said you could add the cost of your trip to the underworld to your last cable bill, or how Hades reacted when accused of stealing the bolt, saying that it would just cause more debts and give him more paperwork. But still, the scene itself is very serious. There's nothing funny about the fact that Percy has come all this way to save his mom and has to leave without her. I'll talk about that more later, but the point is, the few times that the movies actually try to include humor, it ruined serious moments or serious characters. 8. Grover's character was destroyed. The only reason this one isn't higher on the list is because one, Grover is underappreciated in this fandom, and two, some people actually thought Grover was tolerable in the movies. I personally disagree, but Grover was more inaccurate from his book original than he was flat out bad. Though for the most part, being inaccurate from your book original and being terrible are kind of the same thing. One of the few things that the books and the movies have in common about Grover's character is that he's kind of a comedy relief, but in very different ways. In the books, he's a shy, goofy, well-meaning guy who loves enchiladas and eats anything, as satyrs tend to do. In the movie, he was a ladies' man. That bothers me. That is not Grover. Oh, by the way, did I mention that the few comical moments in the movies often involved cussing or sexual tension? Don't forget that these movies were supposed to be based off kids' books. They also removed any form of death of character for him, which bothers me. And yeah, what they did to Grover's character just greatly bothers me. 7. There were so many plot holes. Another big reason why these films never got to book 3 was because of all the plot holes and ruined continuity. Crimson Rogue actually made an entire 30-minute long video about all the ruined continuity from the Percy Jackson movies. So many things in the 2 Percy Jackson movies were either just attempts at references to the books or just lines that they really didn't think through. I already talked about that with Selena. Portraying her as willfully betraying her friends also doesn't work because this means that by the time Sea of Monsters is over, they know Selena is a spy, so that screws stuff up. Another issue with Luke is when he says that he has never met his dad before, which if we recall flashback from book 5, we know to be very untrue. There's a rather important scene where Luke meets his father. This is why I like the Lightning Thief musical. They included tons of nods and references to the books without screwing up later continuity. In fact, it's even more amazing with the musical because musicals don't get sequels. Even though it's practically guaranteed never to have a sequel, they still took the time to include Kronos and make sure that the references they did include didn't ruin the logic of anything. The inclusion of Selena is when she has her moment to the campfire song, and of course when she says, "I was walking in the strawberry fields with Charlie Beckendorf." Instead of ruining continuity by having Luke say that he's never met his dad, the musical includes a part of the campfire song when Luke is singing about his dad. He sings, "I met the guy once, and once was enough." The musical also included a bunch of other wonderful references, like the Hoover Dam. The song "Pick a Side" has a moment where Clarice says Percy couldn't find his way out of a paper bag, which is exactly what Raina says to Annabeth at the end of House of Hades. In the same song, Selena also mentions that she'll pulverize anyone who says that love is worthless. And in the Titan's Curse, she's on the verge of pulverizing the Hunters of Artemis, because they said love was worthless. Anyways, I get distracted. Point is, the musical is awesome. 6. Aging up the characters. I'm losing faith in humanity. This one is just proof that they didn't even read the other books. The entire franchise is based around the fact that when Percy turns 16, he's going to have to make a choice to either save or destroy Olympus. And you're really going to sit there and tell me that he can be 17 in the first movie, when it's a very important plot point that he turns 16 in the 5th book? Really? Another problem with this, in my opinion, and I've talked about this before, is how the thing with Gabe doesn't work. In the books, by the time Percy is 17, he is one of the most powerful and easily intimidating demigods of all time. He easily could have beaten the shit out of Gabe. Why, in the movies, is 17-year-old Percy scared of Gabe? I mean, with Percy being 12 in the first book, it makes sense that he's scared of Gabe. I mean, he's a fucking child, but at 17, not so much. 5. Annabeth was ruined. Because why make characters capable, intimidating, and badass when you can make them just serve as the love interest to the protagonist? The movies tried to make Annabeth intimidating and kind of just failed miserably. They tried to establish upon Annabeth's introduction that she always wins, only to have Percy beat her almost right away, and then they have her do nothing useful on the quest in either of the movies. They also removed any form of character depth for her, and it feels like she's just there to cheer Percy on, like at the beginning of Sea of Monsters. Speaking of the climbing wall scene that kicks off Sea of Monsters, can I nitpick about this a little? Okay, I admit that the climbing wall in the movie actually looks kind of fun, but in the book, it's dripping lava! Also, reaching the top was not considered this grand achievement where the entire camp would cheer for you. It was just an average activity. People were climbing it at all hours like it was no big deal. But the bigger issue with this scene is that we see Annabeth just sitting there cheering Percy on. Annabeth is not the kind of girl to sit around watching demurely while Percy has all the fun on the climbing wall. If anything, she'd be one of the people competing against him. 4. Percy. Percy was the only character that they really put effort into, and even he came across as really awful to me. In the books, Percy's key traits are that he's a well-meaning troublemaker, he has an iconic sense of humor, he's very witty and clever as he outsmarts most of his enemies, and he's very loyal to his friends. In the movies, Percy kind of lost that goofball troublemaker aspect to his character. The humor was completely taken out of the story, both in Percy's personality and the story in general, and he overcomes most of his enemies with brute force as opposed to cleverness, which makes for a really boring character, especially for a protagonist protagonist. And Percy's fatal flaw is that he is too loyal to his friends. We are talking about the kid who would risk the world to save a friend. In the movies, he seems like he's anything but loyal to his friends. In Sea of Monsters, it seems that the reason why he goes on the quest to find the fleece, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this or if I'm missing something, is because he's jealous of Clarice. He's no longer recognized as the kid who saved Olympus, but the kid with the Cyclops for a brother. He wants to prove that he's still got it. That is so unlike book Percy. First off, the very first thing we learn about this character, I kid you not, the first sentence of The Lightning Thief is, look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. The first thing he tells us is that he doesn't want to be a half-blood. He didn't ask to be a glory-seeking demigod. He just wanted a normal life. In the books, the only times that Percy goes on a quest uninvited is in Sea of Monsters and Titan's Curse. And both times it's because one of his best friends is in mortal danger and he has to save them despite the risks. But in the movie, Grover doesn't get kidnapped until after they leave for the quest. And it seems that Percy is very willing to put the lives of his best friends at risk just to prove that he's better than Clarice. Also, in the books, when Percy learns the Great Prophecy and believes that he's going to die, he is deeply unsettled, but he doesn't let that get in the way of doing what's right and fighting the Battle of Manhattan. In the movie, he's just totally self-absorbed, like, guess I gotta find some way around this prophecy now. And no. He literally defeats Kronos with some bullshit about making his own destiny. There are so many problems with that. 3. The message of the story is non-existent. In the Lightning Thief book, the message is obviously about being a hero, specifically contrasting Luke and Percy and showing how Percy does the heroic thing and Luke doesn't. Though Luke ultimately dies a hero later on, there's an obvious contrast between him and Percy that's meant to show you what makes a hero. Percy is a hero because even though life isn't fair, he still makes the best of it. And despite the unfairness of his life as a demigod, of his mother being taken from him, of his stepfather being abusive, of his dad not caring much about him, etc., etc., he still fights for what's right. Luke lets his anger about his unfair circumstances fester and is misguided into believing that the Titans may be better than the gods. He lets his own anger and frustration about his unfair situation influence his actions, whereas Percy has to put his emotions aside and fight for what's right. And that doesn't mean it's easy. In the underworld, Percy is forced to make the heartbreaking decision to leave his mother behind. What's tragic about the story, what sends the entire message, is that after coming all this way to rescue his mother, Percy has to leave without her. Having Grover be the one who stays behind makes no sense. I mean, sure, it would hurt Percy to leave his best friend behind, but it doesn't send the same message about tragedy and loss. Because Percy went on this quest with the motivation of saving his mom. This is another reason why I don't like the underworld scene being made such a comedy relief. It's the lowest point in the story. On the topic of the underworld, I don't like how it was made to look in the movies. I'll admit that it looks cool, but the underworld is not meant to be one massive fiery hell. Last time I checked, there are these places called Asphodel and Elysium. Ever heard of them? Also, even if the underworld was only the fields of punishment, why do you think there'd be fire everywhere? That's a Christian concept, not an ancient Greek one. I'm sure there are underworld punishments in Greek mythology that involve burning in a river of fire or whatnot, but I don't think it's the majority. Speaking of confusing the ancient Greek religion with Christianity, they also just merged Hades with straight up Satan, so, that's great. 2. Perciveth being set up in the first moment. One of the best things about Percy Jackson and the Olympians is watching Percy and Annabeth bond over the years, becoming friends and eventually going from friends to lovers. Setting them up in the first moment is... no! It really just ruins a lot of what makes the PJO books what they are. It destroys so much of the story. Watching Percy and Annabeth bond, become best friends over the years, and actually develop a close friendship is amazing, and the movies ruin that. Not only do they become a couple in the first movie, but they are set up romantically very blatantly in the first moment. Sure, in the books you could see that there was romantic potential and that there was a pretty good possibility of them going from friends to lovers at some point. But it was only hinted at slightly in some awkward but cute romantic moments. It wasn't quite so forced in the books. They had time to develop a friendship, slowly growing closer and having more and more obvious hints of romance as the series progresses. 1. Tyson was ruined. Many of you may be wondering why I'm more mad about Tyson's character being destroyed than I am about Percy or Annabeth or their romance being destroyed. Allow me to explain. Tyson is meant to represent mentally disabled people. That's not something you miss out on reading the books. I mean, sure, if you're an oblivious 9-year-old like I was when you first read the books, you may have missed it. But other than that, you wouldn't miss the fact that Tyson was meant to represent mentally disabled people. An adult reading the book never could have missed that. As much as watching Perciveth, one of my favorite ships ever, and the ship that I spent most of my childhood obsessing over, be massacred through these movies is bad, screwing up Tyson the way they did is different. It's actually politically an issue, erasing the representation of mentally disabled people. No, Tyson is not mentally disabled. He is a Cyclops and therefore does not age at the same rate as a person. He's only really a little kid. But he is meant to represent mentally disabled people, as mentally he is only a small child, but he is still expected to be held to the standards of I was gonna say an adult, but everyone's like 13 in this book, so. We also see Percy hesitant to accept Tyson as his brother near the beginning, but eventually caring for Tyson a lot, and near the end of the book, yelling as loudly and as proudly as he can that Tyson is his brother. It's actually really amazing. Tyson is not exactly the biggest or the strongest or the smartest, but he has his own strengths, like being naturally good at making weapons from being a Cyclops, and proving that a big heart can go a long way. In the movie, he just seems a bit unfocused and clueless, but not mentally disabled. They try to add in how Percy is hesitant to accept Tyson as his brother, though it comes up much shorter. And they try to send a message about accepting people with physical differences since Tyson has the one eye, but again, it wasn't really done well. It also seems to me that in the Sea of Monsters movie, Percy's hesitance to accept Tyson as his brother has very little to do with the one eye, but just with the fact that Tyson is, like I said, clueless. When he thinks Tyson is dead, he's all like, I never called him brother. All I ever wanted was a brother, but I was too wrapped up in myself. The only time that Percy actually confesses to and regrets being a self-absorbed jerk, only to defeat Kronos 5 minutes later with some bullshit about I make my own destiny, and once again, be a self-absorbed jerk. The point I'm making is that the filmmakers erase representation of mentally disabled people, a group which is so rarely represented, especially for kids. I may be mad about them ruining Perciveth, and all the other characters for that matter, but it doesn't quite stick a nerve with me the same way that they ruined Tyson does. Anyways, guys, that's it for today. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I am losing my voice, so don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye!